All right, opening your Bibles back over to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. And I want to, we've got about 20 minutes. We'll work through a few things here at the end of this chapter. So you got the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew and Luke also have this passage in theirs as well. And it's a little more concise from Mark than the others. We have several things that are missing. But I think one of the more interesting things is when the disciples come up, they say, hey, we should send the people away. They're hungry. And then Jesus says, you give them something to eat. Why would he say that? Why would he tell the disciples, you give them something to eat? What is he trying to get them to do?
He's going to teach them through the events that follow. I'm not sure they understood, even after he said it, they must have said, well, how are we supposed to do that?
Yeah.
But they had to see the events unfold before they had any understanding of what was going to happen.
Okay, good. Has Jesus fed multitudes with a few pieces of bread and fish before? He has. Was the 4,000 after this? It is. You're right. I apologize. I got it backwards. Well, I'm studying in different places, so yeah, you're right. But nevertheless, we'll come back to that. So nevertheless, from the things they have seen and the other miracles, should they not know that he can take care of them? This is before the limited commission. Correct. But they have seen him perform miracles. But I do think he's trying to get them to stop, and as Mick was saying, and think as they begin to see these events unfold. So when they had no answer, he tells them, what do you have? Go and see. They come back, they have the loaves of bread and the fish, and he begins to break them. And performing that miracle, everyone's fed and satisfied. They even bring up 12 baskets full later. And there were 5,000 men, or 10 to 12,000 total. But then after this, we have the incident of him walking on the water. There's more information given to us in the other ones. I think it's interesting that Mark does not tell us that Peter asked to come out upon the water with him and walk on the water that we see in the other passages. But he's up there on top of the mountain to pray. The passage here in Mark tells us they are out in the middle of the sea. So we're looking about 3-4 miles away. What time is it? Yeah, it's the fourth watch, putting it around 3-4 in the morning. It's dark. There's a wind. Maybe it's a storm blowing in. So I don't know if there'll be much of a moon, but even if there was, could you see a boat struggling out in the middle of the sea 4 miles away on top of a mountain? That's pretty far. Maybe he did something miraculous there with his eyes to see that. Then he comes out there and begins to walk, and the text tells us that he intended to go by them. That was his intention, to walk by. And I guess ignore them or go meet them on the other side. But then they see him, like they think it's a ghost. They get afraid. He tells them there in verse 30, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. So it tells us they didn't realize it was Jesus. He gets into the boat. He doesn't say anything. And here in Mark, he gets in the boat with them, and then the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. But here's the interesting verse 52. For they, the disciples, had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Do you remember what happened in the parallel passages to this? How did they react when Jesus said, hush, be still? Yeah. Is this not God? They proclaim him as God. They vocalize it. Here, Mark tells us their heart was hardened. Where's Jody? She left. Oh, Jody. All right, their heart was hardened. So what is a hardened? How well can you plant a seed in hardened dirt? Very hard to do. So something can't get in there. The truth of the matter of what's going on isn't getting in there. So one passage in the parallel tells us that outwardly they're proclaiming him as God, but inwardly Mark is showing us something different. What are we seeing from the disciples here?
I don't think they're incompatible, because we know later they still don't get it.
Right. They don't understand.
They may call him God, and he said that in front of them multiple times before the end.
Right. But they don't.
Still don't get it.
But they don't understand that. That like the feeding of the 4,000 over in chapter 8, that's the same situation comes up, and they have the same reaction when they tell Jesus to go. They should send him away. It says, "Where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people?" And we go through that same scenario again. Don't they remember from the last time he had fed the 5,000? And here he is. He's walking on the water. And they're astonished. Why are they astonished that he's walking on water? I mean, it would be astonishing to see, but think about it. Should that really astonish them that he would be able to do that? After everything they've seen him do. If he's able to do this, he should be able to do that.
Well, we don't know what he's going to do next.
Yeah.
What he's doing is contrary to normal events. So when they see something new that he does, it's not something that they would expect.
That is true. But the idea, I think Joan's right, the idea of who he is hasn't penetrated the heart. They're vocalizing it. I don't think they've really truly meditated upon what that actually means, to really stop and think what they are saying about who Jesus is. Like we may be tempted to read this and think, well, if I had been there, I would have not have reacted the way they did. But a hardened heart, I would have understood who Jesus was. Jim?
I'm not sure I would have, but here, you get used to things. Even they got used to Jesus healing. Okay, he can heal. Sweet, he can heal. They'd never seen him walk on water before. They'd not seen him multiply food 1,000,000 times before. That they were used to, even though it was against the laws of nature.
Okay.
They didn't wrap their mind, even though, again, as Matthew said, they declared him God, which was true, but they still hadn't wrapped their minds around it. It didn't mean more than he can.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. And that's what I think Mark is trying to get us to see. For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. So why bring that up when he's talking about the walking on the water? Because they hadn't gained the insight of who he really was. They were astonished. Why were they utterly astonished? For, Gar, verse 52, they had not gained any insight. They didn't grasp who he is. They're vocalizing it, but they didn't quite get it yet. Just like with Peter, not so, Lord, I'll never let anyone lay a hand on you. You're talking to God. What are you doing? If you really understood who he was, you wouldn't say things like that, not to God. So he didn't quite get it. And I think Jim's right on that. So that word,
In some ways, that adds to the credibility of the gospel, because if somebody's making up the story, those would already get a hold of it, and they wouldn't want to paint them in such a bad light.
oh no.
So it's kind of interesting that it leads you to believe somebody wouldn't make that up, or they hadn't already gained insight at this point.
And if it was being made up, it would be a very humanly perspective, like, oh yeah, of course they were astonished. Oh man, yeah. Yeah, because we would all have that same reaction. But the astonishment is because they don't fully grasp. They haven't meditated, internalized what it means when they say he is God. They didn't. Go ahead.
And also, correct me if I'm thinking this wrong, no one ever asked none of the 12, said, hey, we've got this new problem over here, can you handle it? Never did they say that. Like, someone's dead, could you raise them? It was always Jesus who went and did this stuff.
Or a great example of that would be they're not the ones that went and said, hey, we can't get this demon out of this guy, Lord. No, it was the Father had to come and do it. I think they were probably embarrassed.
So, yeah, they had blinders on. Just
Well, and it's understandable when you look at, again, we were saying sometimes we think, well, I would have done better, but we have hindsight. Would we have? Probably not. I probably would have been stuck in the same rut as the disciples were. They weren't hardened hearts, kind of like, not like Pharaoh's, but they looked, you could say, they looked away from Jesus, and they were not good pupils of his teachings. They neglected to really stop and think and meditate, probably the best way to put it, to meditate on all these events that have been taking place with Jesus and the things that he is doing. They failed to apply these things. And because they have failed to apply these things, I think they had a harder time to have the right insight on what is actually going on around them. Jesus allowed them to experience this crisis, I think, so they could improve their trust and improve their understanding of who Jesus is. Just like what Mick was saying with the feeding of the 5,000. He posed that to them. You feed them. He wanted them to stop and really start to think about who he is. He wanted them to follow along these events as they played out in the feeding of these 5,000, because he knows where they're at, and there's a struggle there. Christ and calm go together. And I think if these disciples had understood the lesson of the preceding miracle of the loaves and the fish, they would not have worried. They would not have been out there in the sea and been worried, because now we're going to go back to when Jesus told them to get into the boat. Verse 45, immediately, this is after the feeding, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him. That word made is a forceful made. I forgot to look up the exact word. I do not remember it being a forceful. He made them get in the boat. Almost like, hey, guys, get in the boat. In the boat. Without me, and go. He had to make them do it. He wanted them out there, and he wanted them to go through this. Why? So they can see, I think, what they're doing. If they understood who Jesus was, they would not have been worried about what was happening to them out there in the sea, like they were. Mick, and then...
But they did know they needed to wake him up and ask for help.
That's right. that was before. That's not this particular one, but that was before when he was asleep on the boat. Lord, don't you care that we're perishing? But what did he say to them? You of little faith, do you really think that you would have perished? No, Jim.
On a slightly lighter note, you've got 12 who he says get in the boat. Not all of these are saved, not all of these are fishermen.
No.
So, or Levi and the rest of
Yeah, I was trying to say Matthew.
go across the Sea of Galilee. Hey, I'm a tax collector. What do I know about rowing? that struck me as funny when it specifically says winds were contrary and they had to row.
Yep. But if they really understood who Jesus was and the missions he's already given to them, they should not have been worried. But like you said, if I was there, I'd be scared to death. I would have been. I would not have had the insight yet, as Mark puts it here. It's for our understanding. I mean, we go through a lot in our lives, and we think, well, I ought to be here, or I ought to be here in my spirituality. Well, look at the disciples. They were with Jesus. They saw the miracles. They heard directly from him. How long did it take them to grow spiritually? In 3 years, how far did they make it? A little bit. A little bit. Because what is the biggest problem that they ran into? Was their biggest problems with really understanding who Jesus was.
They never did.
They thought they already knew who he should be. And that's still the problem we've got today. People think they know who Jesus is when they do not. They vocalize, oh, God, he's God, just like they did here. Oh, he must be God. But their hearts were hardened. The truth of everything that's been going on didn't actually penetrate their heart because they're not meditating on these things and thinking about who Jesus really is. It's a struggle they have, and it's a struggle we've still got today. And we need to remember that. And that's why I do always emphasize when we read our Bibles, we need to read it as if we're reading it for the first time and not assume we know it. Mick.
We could read the whole story, so it makes more sense to us. They didn't have the whole story. For example, the wind and the waves were real,
Yeah.
and there were a lot of events that were real to them. They had a certain amount of faith in Christ, but they didn't really know for sure what he was going to do in each event.
That's right.
Well, we can read it now and read the whole story, start to finish. They're playing this day by day, hour by hour.
Okay, and I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to end with this. 'Cause I feel bad for hammering on the disciples that as if they didn't have any understanding. They did, because even though they were afraid and they were scared, when Jesus was on the mountain and he looked out there in the middle of the sea, what was going on? They were struggling with the oar because the wind was contrary.
They were still doing what he said.
Yes, despite the fact it would have been so much easier to turn around and just come back to the shore, they didn't. They kept fighting. They kept fighting. Did they understand? No. Could they see the future? They could not. Didn't mean that they were where they needed to be. There was a lot more for them to gain. That's what Mark is trying to get us to see. They didn't gain insight into the events of what happened earlier. There was still a hardened hearts there. But they were moving in the right direction. And remember, Jesus made them go out there. He wanted them to go through this difficult time in their life so that they will learn to trust him. And that same thing happens to us sometimes. We don't understand why some of the difficulties we go through. But it could be that God put us there so that we can learn to trust him. Trust him. Good discussion. Great passage. Sometimes we overlook a lot of the things we can glean from that. Simple little thing, but it applies so much to the lives that we find ourselves in today, I think. And that was a good discussion. Good. I wish more people could have been here to be part of that. That was